Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Hot Rod Bob, and you got gas. Thank you for being a gasaholic and tuning in this morning. You are there, aren't you? I'm looking for you now. I don't see anybody yet. There you are. Okie dokie, we can get started. Back in the days of carriages, before the days of the car, there were rumble seats. Now, a rumble seat tends to be an American term, not one held closely by other countries, but they did have the same type of seats on the back of their carriages at first, and the Americans called it a rumble seat. The British called it a dicky seat, and they were also referred to as a mother-in-law seat, because after all, where did you put her? I know a lot of guys wish they still had rumble seats, but that's another story altogether, and we'll go into that at another time when the wives aren't watching. So, think about that for a little bit. All right, so the rumble seat came into effect back actually in the early to mid 1800s. Now, the addition of an occasional seating area was part of the coach or carriage at the time. And we've got to remember, we didn't have cars yet, so they had coaches or carriages or horse and buggies to draw people around with, and that was what it was. Now, Webster's An American Dictionary of the English Language that came out in 1865 said it defines a dicky seat or a boot. You got to remember, this is the British part of it, which was a seat for servants behind a carriage, similar to a dicky seat on European phaetons or a spider single seat. Okay, so there were a lot of different names for these. Now, the bench or spindly supported single seat on the side was for a groom or a footman. Okay, so you don't let the groom in the vehicle either. Early traditions, they have since changed. So a roadster later on, when we came in with cars, there was still that issue. So before World War I, a dicky or a rumble seat didn't always fold into the bodywork. It was something that was there, and it was always open. Now, in such optional passenger seat arrangements, typically they were not integrated into the rear deck lid of the car. That was just added on. But when occupied, well, later on, those seats did become part of the trunk. You lost your trunk, basically, for an extra seat. Now, there was some minimal storage area there, but not as much as just a regular trunk. The best known for these rumble seats were probably the early Fords, but they were not the only one. They were just the ones that produced the most of them. All right, so there was a folding area in the back. The trunk lid was actually hinged at the opposite end, and you would fold it down and close it. There was a seat in there. It stayed relatively watertight when closed. Now, you'd find these on roadsters, coupes, and cabriolets, which only had seating in the main part of the car for 2, maybe 3 people. You got to remember, cars were a lot more narrow at that point in time. So Model A's were probably the most, as I said, prolific with these rumble seats, and they were often referred to, these cars that had them were often referred to sometimes as sport coupes or sport roadsters. Now, the rumble seat passengers were exposed to the elements, another reason to put the mother-in-law back there. You didn't want to piss off the wife, so she could stay in the front. The problem was when you still had one of these roadsters and you had children. Now, you got to remember back in those days, too, a car heater was not all that normal. And when you had a roadster, which had no windows, no heat, the passenger seat in the rumble seat was just as uncomfortable as being in the front of the car. Now, heaters came in about the late 19-teens, and those were based not on a water heater like we're used to today, but it was an exhaust manifold that had a chamber in it that had a tube going into the engine, the driver's compartment. And as the vehicle moved, the airflow through the engine compartment would push hot air coming off the exhaust manifold into the car. So as long as you were moving, you had some heat flow. You couldn't control it very much, except there was maybe a flapper valve that you could open and close to slow down the flow of the heat. But that was about it. Still, the people in the rumble seat, or the dicky seat, or the mother-in-law seat had no heat at all. Now, Ford Model A's did have an optional canvas cover and side curtains, both for the Roadster, where the passengers normally sat, and for the area behind where the rumble seat was. It wasn't very popular. I guess the guys that owned the cars didn't think the mother-in-law was worth the extra $10 or $15 for that cover area. And the other issue was when your top was up on your Roadster and they were sitting in the rumble seat, you couldn't necessarily hear them giving you directions. It's a nice way of saying they were telling you where to go. But that's another story altogether. Now, American cars with rumble seats stayed in production as an option through about 1939, the last recorded year of American cars with rumble seats. Chevrolet went through 1938, Ford, Dodge, and Plymouth all through 1939 on the convertible models. Now, I've not seen one on a coupe of those cars, but I think the Chevrolet's was a coupe. So you can check that out. Now, the Brits, well, they did it a little bit longer, and the Triumph 2000 Roadster, produced until 1949, still had the dicky seat. And you got to remember, the Brits called it a dicky seat. Have you ever ridden in one of these? I haven't. Have I ever owned a car with a rumble seat? Yes. Now, it didn't come from the factory. Good morning, Craig. How are you doing? And Marilyn and Tara, how are you? Sorry I haven't said hello to everybody that's watching this morning. I did have a car with a rumble seat. Back in high school, I had a 1960 Ford Falcon. And being the aspiring customizer I was, influenced by the likes of George Barris and Dean Jeffries and those, I put a rumble seat in my Ford Falcon. Now, it wasn't a real tricky thing to do. I put hinges on the back, or the normal locking part of the trunk. Disconnected the hinges up front, used some chains to keep the seat from going back too far, and then built a seat platform and padded the back of the rear or the trunk lid. I had a latch up in the front part to keep it closed and keep it relatively watertight. Did I ride people in that seat? You bet. Friends used to love to ride in that seat. We'd cruise Van Nuys Boulevard for it. And even in the early days of this car and this, I was part of a couple of parades, and people rode in the back seat. I was in the Bradley for Mayor parade. Tom Bradley here, our mayor of Southern California, back in the, I guess it was late 60s, mid to late 60s. I was in the parade with that car a couple of times and had people in the back seat waving, doing their hi waves from the back, and people would like doing that. Cruising down Van Nuys Boulevard with the car, I got pulled over a couple of times by officers looking at it and going, what the heck? Now, I did have seatbelts back there. I had seatbelts in the car, and I had seatbelts back for the rumble seat as well. So people were belted in securely. The seat was okay. It was made of wood with a vinyl covering on it and padded, so it was relatively comfortable. But they did have seatbelts to make sure they stayed in place as much as possible. Now, I had to add extra springs to the back of the Falcon because with two people sitting that far back in the car would tend to sag. So I altered things just a little bit. I put helper springs on the shock absorbers. Most people call them coilovers now because they're manufactured that way. Back in those days, it was actually two clamps and a spring in between it, and you would bolt that into your car. I also had helper springs or extra leaves on the bottom of the spring, and I had 6-inch long shackles to raise the car up. So without people in the back of the car, the back end of the car bounced pretty nicely. It was great for spinning the tires, too, because I took the weight off the rear, shifting it forward with a California rake on the car. And it was a fun thing to do. But, hey, rumble seats. Now, the Alexander brothers built an AMX, a show car for American Motors, and they put a rumble seat in it. And that is one of the things that inspired me to do the rumble seat in my little Ford Falcon. Did I have fun with it? Yeah. Did my mother-in-law ever ride in it? I didn't have one. But my mother never rode in it either. Heck, she couldn't climb into the car. It was too high in the back. That's one of the things the cops didn't like when there was no people in the back. They thought the back end of the car was a little too high. Of course, they didn't know what the regulations were, but I got pulled over on a regular basis. As a matter of fact, that rumble seat got me out of a couple of tickets a few times. Cops would pull me over. They'd see the hinges on the back. They were nice chrome-plated pieces. And they would ask me, what were those for? And then I'd open up the back and show them the rumble seat. They'd laugh a little bit. They'd check it out. They'd check to see if it was a vehicle violation of sorts. It wasn't. And we talked for a bit. I was just that little curly-haired young kid with a hot rodded Ford Falcon. And they'd pretty much just say, laugh, and, all right, don't do it again, or whatever I was doing, and drive safely. And I did. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got gas, the morning edition. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being a gasaholic. If you're watching, you are a gasaholic. Kit Dickerman's here, Jay Black, Jay Thomas, all tuning in right now. I hope you enjoyed this little bit on rumble seats. And again, I'm Hot Rod Bob. This is brought to you by Beach Underwriting, Irwindale Speedway, and Irwindale Drag Strip, Moon Eyes, Tucker Tire, and Service Tech for all your service shop equipment needs, whether you've got a commercial shop or a home shop. Talk to the guys at Service Tech in Simi Valley, California. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got gas, the morning edition. Thanks for tuning in. Hi, Nick. How are you doing today? Take care, folks, and hope to see you at a race real soon.